take the hundreds of hours of footage of whether I've ever leveled that accusation against a Democrat? No, I haven't. Am I one of these people who say, I want America to be normal? What is normal? America's exceptional. That's a worldview. And I think that it is anti-American to charge at the other side the idea that somehow the fact that they're weird, it's the TikTok era's way of saying basket of deplorables. Basket of deplorables was to the Facebook era what weird is to the TikTok era. And I just don't think it's productive.
In this interview, Vivek Ramaswamy gets into this wave of attacks that people are using on social media, calling each other weird, and gives his take on how it could affect the political landscape in this year's 2024 election, and how weird it is that calling somebody weird is this new way of attacking your political opponent. I think you're going to enjoy it, so let's go ahead and get into it.
Now, you objected this week to Democrats trying to frame the Trump-Vance ticket as weird, which is the new talking point of the Harris campaign. Yeah. You called it dumb and juvenile. Is that what you mean when you talk about the free, mature exchange of ideas? Do you think that political candidates should aspire for more mature rhetoric and debate?
I think that mislabeling or just substituting for debate, instead castigating an entire group of people as weird, I think is problematic. And I can go into it in some depth here. I think America and our heritage, our founding fathers, were in some sense weird compared to old world standards, right? Benjamin Franklin invented the lightning rod. He invented the bifocal spectacle. Thomas Jefferson invented a swivel chair, a polygraph test. They had beliefs. I mean, Joseph Priestley was welcomed to the United States from old world England because he had beliefs that defied the traditional Anglican church. So I just think part of what makes America great is that we don't dismiss ideas based on being weird. And even worse, we don't just say, oh, you're a group of people who has a heterodox idea. That's weird and I'm not going to engage in it. The way we're going to actually engage each other is by engaging in the content of our own ideas. So I do think that it is a little bit adolescent, a little juvenile to say, whoa, they're weird. No, I don't think that's the way we should do it. And by the way, I try to be consistent. I think when I ran my campaign, a lot of Republicans had a different view, right? They said that we just want to go back to a normal America. You didn't hear that from me, right? Because normal compared to what? Weird compared to what? I don't just care about making America great again. I care about making America greater than it has ever been before. I think if your allegation against the other side is that they're weird, there's two problems with that. One is it denies the possibility of exceptionalism. Okay, Albert Einstein famously didn't wear socks. Nikola Tesla had a weird issue with the number 3. You could go straight down the list. There's some German philosopher, his name is slipping my mind, but his famous quote is, the only thing worse than madness is the utter absence of it altogether, which leads to imbecility. And America's the opposite of that spirit. So it denies the possibility of exceptionalism. It got under my skin a little bit. Even see a guy like Pete Buttigieg use the word weird multiple times over the weekend to talk about J.D. Vance and Donald Trump. It kind of hurts a little bit because I knew Pete in college, actually. And one of the things that's almost certainly true about him is he was probably viewed as weird for much of the 90s, growing up as a hyper-articulate, scholastic, high-achieving, gay person in the 1990s in Indiana. And that's too bad. But when I got to know him, he wasn't somebody in college who I remembered as denigrating people who disagreed with him as weird. And that's one of the reasons I actually respected him. So the other thing is it actually makes national unity impossible. Right? When you designate the other side as weird, now what are Republicans in a position to do? Well, I think Republicans could have at least as strong of a case saying you're weird because you can't define a woman, because you want to fight for men competing with women in women's sports, because you want to take away our gas stoves. That's weird. And then it becomes a context of which side is more weird, measured against a self-referential standard, as opposed to saying that, you know what? American exceptionalism involves embracing ideas that might seem weird at the time. J.D. Vance, maybe you like his solutions, maybe you don't, but our fertility crisis is a major problem in this country. We're well below replacement rate, and we're going to an economic Armageddon if we get to a ratio of workers to retirees that's less than 2-to-1, which we hit in the year 2060. But the problem with this level of discourse about labeling the other side weird is no one's talking about that, which is, I do think, a, if not existential, major economic ticking time bomb for the country. And instead talking about which side is weird versus not. It just feels un-American to me.
Right.
And so, yes, calling that out in forceful terms, I think is useful if we're able to also progress that discussion to say that we're not in the business of calling one side weird. And I haven't, I challenge you to take the hundreds of hours of footage of whether I've ever leveled that accusation against a Democrat. No, I haven't. Am I one of these people who say, I want America to be normal? What is normal? America is exceptional. That's a worldview. And I think that it is anti-American to charge at the other side the idea that somehow the fact that they're weird, it's the TikTok era's way of saying basket of deplorables. Basket of deplorables was to the Facebook era what weird is to the TikTok era. And I just don't think it's productive for our country, our culture, or the possibility of national solidarity. And so, yes, I am against it. And I stand by that.
Just to
Now, that's an interesting take. I don't think it actually compares to Hillary Clinton literally calling half of America a basket of deplorables. But I kind of get what he's saying, right? And I wish it would have that effect, because I think that would help ensure that Trump wins this election. Unfortunately, when it comes to things like this, the Democrats tend to have the upper hand when it comes to these things, because they come out in masses. You see the mainstream media come out and just levy waves and waves of attacks saying that this is bad, you can't do this, and there's just not that response from the right. If there is, it's on social media, it's on a channel like mine, and it just doesn't get the eyeballs that the mainstream media does. So it has a greater effect in harming the right or the Republicans than it does in hurting the left.
Just
and
to be fair here, to look at the candidate on the other side of the aisle, Trump this week on Truth Social, he called Kamala Harris lying Kamala. He called Nancy Pelosi a witch and batshit crazy. And he accused Fox News hosts of being on the Soros payroll. Is that any better in terms of rhetoric than Democrats calling him weird?
So look, I think that there's a couple things going on here. One is it was a systematic strategy. It's not one person who in the Democratic Party is authentically their own style of fighting, right? Who might have an authentic style of how they compete in the ring. I think it was like over 175 times in 48 to 72 hours on cable television, the top Democrats invoked that word weird. So this became a systematic campaign strategy and vision. I'm okay with individual politicians being the most authentic version of themselves. As I said
Even
earlier,
if it's juvenile,
everyone
it's okay to use.
As an overall systematic strategy to label an entire group of people, that's one thing. And I think that there's also a big difference here. I have a different level of concern if, whichever side it is, if you're denigrating the other side's voters as a basket of deplorables or weird or whatever, I have a deeper issue with that and a deeper concern about that than I do of individuals sparring with each other as.
But Trump has done that, to be clear. Trump says that if you're Jewish and you vote Democrat, you've lost your mind.
If you are Jewish, regardless of Israel, if you're Jewish, if you vote for a Democrat, you're a fool, an absolute fool. Number one, she doesn't like Israel. Number two, she doesn't like Jewish people. You know it. I know it. Everybody knows it, and nobody wants to say it.
Well, I mean, Joe Biden, to the extent of like Joe Biden, that's as sarcastic of a comment as Joe Biden saying that if you vote for Donald Trump, then you ain't black, to a black audience. And I'm not somebody who makes an overly big deal about him having said that.
I gotta disagree with him there on that. It's pretty well known that within the black community, they just historically are voting Democrat no matter what. But when it comes to the Jewish community, I don't believe that that's the case. The reality is, this Kamala Harris campaign, they have sided with Hamas. And that became apparent to me when, even though the Democrats need to win Pennsylvania desperately, they went on and passed on Josh Shapiro to be Kamala Harris's running mate for vice president. So to me, that was a spit in the face to the Jewish community, especially with the selection of Tim Walz, who apparently supports all these, vandalism sessions and riots that they disguise and call protests. But maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm wrong. And it just doesn't relate to me at all to Joe Biden's comment when he's on The Breakfast Club or whatever that show is with Charlemagne and say that if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. Because that's, what he's trying to do is he's just trying to remind people that you're black and you vote Democrat, remember? And I think that's pompous, and I think that's actually pretty despicable in my opinion. But
so I think that we have to preserve some level of ability to engage in humor. Humor is also unifying as a country. And I think a lot of people who just see individual clips of Donald Trump but don't know him, if you've watched over the last 20 years, he's a funny guy. And I do think that sense of humor, and I think Joe Biden, in fairness, in that particular comment he made too, was engaging in humor. And so I think if we're just looking at what's actually true, right? What's just the truth of the matter? You could airlift one particular quote or not. And I'm not here to defend one individual person or another individual person. I'm just here to tell you what I believe is true. I think that our country is in trouble if our political discourse and the kind of argument we make depends on which side labels the other as weird or nonconformist, because it requires a reference standard that is something other than the United States of America as a whole. Instead, I think the right question is, how are we going to make America greater than it's ever been before? And the number one way we're going to do that is by actually engaging in the open exchange of even unconventional ideas. And we would be remiss if we didn't get to the content of what spawned this. We have a fertility crisis in this country. Countries from Hungary to Singapore have adopted what we would view as extreme measures to address that problem, still with very limited success. And so the idea that because J.D. Vance proposed some level of solutions, maybe they're the right solutions, maybe they're the wrong ones, and you have completely entitled to your view on whether those are the right or wrong solutions. I think that we repress the kind of innovative culture if we just say, if you say something that falls outside of my version of an Overton window, you're weird, and your people who agree with you are weird. I don't think that's productive. I do think that having a competing vision from a Democrat that says, you know what, I would approach this differently, but here's how we would deal with the fertility crisis that's compelling. That's what I see as actually missing. And that's where I want to see our body politic go. We're not there now, but I think we can get there. And I think it's a big part of why I'm interested in conversations like the one that you and I are having. I'm interested in potential private sector action to de-silo the media and cultural commentary and political landscape. And you know what? If I was to go back and run for president, for all of the political disadvantages that strategy presented, I would still go back and do it again the exact same way, because I just think that is what the country needs right now. And, I'm hopeful that, and I know this, most ordinary Americans are rooting for the same thing. I just hope more people in the political leadership do the same. And if you look at, it sounds like you were looking at a few of my recent posts on X, look at one that I made, about a week or two ago, where I'll repeat it here. My best advice to the Republican Party is don't focus on Kamala Harris, actually. I think that some of the criticisms of Kamala Harris, I don't think end up being particularly compelling to an independent voter anyway. I think the right strategy, self-interested to win the election, but also self-interested for the country, is offer our own vision for who we are and what we stand for as Americans, and what is our vision for the future of the United States of America. And I think that the biggest risk is that, frankly, we get distracted by a lot of the shenaniganery of which candidate gets swapped in or not when, to instead forget to offer our own vision. And for my part, that's what I am most intently focused on.
But I'm wondering from you, looking forward to the future, if Trump does win in 2024, would you consider working in his cabinet?
Yeah, of course I would. I want to have a maximal impact on the country. I'm also considering other paths. For me, the top focus is a lot changes, depends on what happens in the next several months leading up to the election. And so my focus is on doing whatever I can to make a positive contribution to the right outcome in November. After that, one of the things I found is that when I make my own personal elaborate plans, it never goes according to that plan anyway. I'm guided by the same purpose that led me to the presidential race in the first place, which is that I do think that we're in the middle of a kind of national identity crisis, a loss of ourself, a sense of who we are as a nation. I ran for president because I think that there's an opportunity still to fill that gap, especially to reach the next generation. There's a number of paths for what's ahead for me, whether it's through the executive branch, whether it's through the legislative branch, whether it's in the state of Ohio versus at a national scale. I'm evaluating all of those possibilities, but we're going to have to see what happens this November before we jump the shark there.
Now, of all of the Trump primary opponents, I'd say you're the one who finished the race with a higher profile than you started with. You really built a national brand, and you did it with a unique media strategy. How did you do that, and what should Trump do in the general that you did in the primary? Is it about taking on confrontational journalists like you did? Is it about treading into waters that candidates wouldn't normally?
Well, I think authenticity is all else equal a good thing to expect of public officials. So each person's different, so you got to look inside and say what's important to you. As I shared with you, one of the things that is important to me as a core value, I think it's a core American value, and it's certainly a core value to me, is the open exchange of actual debate and ideas. That I think makes the country stronger. So I believe that. I've long believed that. I wanted to run my campaign accordingly. One of the things I said is anytime somebody's a protester, we had a number of protests or interruptions. We had other competitors, maybe in the primary, that took a different approach there. security guards or whatever escorting people out. My approach was different. Give somebody the mic. If they want to be heard and they're going to come here with a different point of view, they get to be heard. When you're the only person in a room who believes what you do, I think it's a good thing for you to be able to have the space to say it. But in return, to stay in that room and hear what everybody else has to say in response. Those were probably some of the best moments in the campaign and some of the most productive moments of what came out of the campaign, I hope, for the country, especially amongst younger people on college campuses and other areas that we visited. Same thing with respect to talking to media. I think that other candidates took a advised, maybe well-advised strategy of not talking to people who would ask them confrontational questions, stick within conservative media. I actually took the opposite approach. Again, I think our country is at its best when we're actually able to exchange competing visions of ideas. I learned a lot through that experience. Some for the better. I think mostly if I was to do it again, I would do it exactly the same way. But I would go eyes wide open in to, I think, some risks with that strategy. I mean, many of the podcasts that we would do were multi-hour podcasts. And I think that there is a separate, not Republican versus Democrat or political battle, but there's a separate industry battle going on between legacy media, cable news outlets, which develop basically short form or snippet content with longer form modes of reaching voters in other ways. And one of the things is those two things come into conflict with each other, where if you and I are having a 2-hour conversation, I'm going to say something that has context attached to it from what I might have said an hour ago. I think cable news has the ability to snippet that into 2-minute snippets that I think leave a lot of people, I think, frankly, who aren't accessing that new media only with a contextless depiction of what someone said. So that's not just specific to me. I think it probably applies across the board. Right. That incentive structure now explains to me why a lot of my other fellow peers running in that primary didn't necessarily gravitate to those long form formats. Maybe they were politically smarter than I was as a strategy, but nonetheless, even if I was to do it again, I would still do it the same way. I think that's the right way to go. I visited places like the South Side of Chicago, which is not a traditional place that Republicans go during a primary. My campaign advisors told me it was a waste of time, money, and a lot of risk. And considering that I didn't win, I got 4th in the Iowa caucus, maybe they had a point. But I do think that, for me at least, it was some of those experiences that were the most enriching ones when I was talking to audiences that didn't agree with 100% or even most of what I had to say. But I think that I left those rooms, and I think those audiences left those rooms getting something out of it that probably doesn't usually come out of a normal political campaign. So my best advice to the Republican Party is show up in the places, not just where we're supposed to show up or predicted to show up, but show up in unconventional places too. We're not running to lead a party, we're running to lead a nation. And the reality is that doesn't mean you should change your views or modify what you have to say, but at least demonstrate that part of what unites us as Americans is our commitment to still say, you get to have your own views as long as I get to express mine in return. We leave it to the voters to decide which view governs, and that's what makes America great.
And that's what we're seeing lately, a little bit more of, at least when it comes to Donald Trump and his campaign. He was recently on Aiden Ross' podcast. He went on with Logan Paul, amongst a bunch of other young, famous podcasters. And I think it's a good thing. And on the contrary to that, we see some of these other guys that are declining Kamala Harris's request to come on their podcast, which I think is pretty funny. Kind of gives Trump a little bit of a leg up, which is a good thing. I enjoy seeing the young people actually gravitating more towards Trump than they are towards Kamala. It gives me hope for the future of this country. And I hope it does for you too. If it does, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and I'll see you guys in the next video.